can't you see way up in the sky? Making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done.
I can't break away.
Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why.
I can't
Break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Good evening and welcome in for episode 1.33 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History. 33 episodes. It still gets me every time now how far past my estimate of how many episodes I would need. But we are well into what I would deem the stretch here. Probably between 10 and 15 episodes left, somewhere in there, before we wrap up and kind of leave a man named Napoleon in charge of things. But we have some ground to cover before we get there, considering we've actually only mentioned Napoleon like twice in reality. We are entering into his phase. Not tonight, but probably within about 2 episodes, where we're really going to start seeing him take over the narrative. We have to cover some things first. I had to draw up my own map this week because no one was demonstrating what I'm showing in the middle there tonight. Tried to make the text large enough so it's viewable on the stream. I will be zooming in as well. But thanks for all for being here tonight. Thanks for hanging out last week in what was a weird episode situation where we kind of split things in two. And for those of you that missed the current events discussion with a historical kind of flavor to it as to how we got to where we are right now with things in Ukraine, go have a look. It was a pretty good hour and a half of going through why we are doing some things and why we are not doing some things. But before we had that conversation, we let ourselves into the post-Thermidorian era and the end of the Jacobins as an organized club in France. But what we had been doing for about 3 episodes prior to that was discussing how the biggest reason that France had kind of started to pull back from the concept of the Great Terror was that the military successes had started to come in the spring of 1794, and that the combined threat of the Allied armies on the northeastern frontier, as well as the Federalist Revolt and the war in the Vendée, had all just kind of been pushed. Dustin, 21 months, tier 1. And thank you very much, my friend, and welcome in. Well, we talked about how all of these reasons that had been the reasons for the consolidation of power under the Committee of Public Safety had ceased to be reasons. And it had become very hard to convince people that all of the emergency murder that was happening was really still necessary when there really wasn't an emergency. Well, that French military success that had weakened the reasoning for the Committee of Public Safety's tyranny continued well through all of 1794 and into 1795. And it was the backdrop against the post Thermidorian reaction political pendulum swing, which we talked about last episode, back to the conservative right. Things were, in fact, going so well that by the time we finish this episode, these following things will have happened. Prussia will be asking France for peace terms. The Austrians will have pulled their armies back across the Rhine to the east. The French will entirely occupy the Netherlands and Belgium again. And the British will have gathered up all their army toys and gone home. These victories that we're going to go through tonight will not only shut down the area around Flanders as the main center of the war, that's that lowlands area in Belgium, and we're going to change our focus with respect to where the epicenter of the war is as we look to Italy very soon and a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. But these victories will also stabilize the French domestic economy. And we're going to get into the economy as well tonight. Because from here on out, every time this fully French mobilized nation and its army occupies a new territory, the people and resources of that territory are going to be flat out exploited to serve the needs of a far more cynical France. Of course, this is the complete opposite of that lofty revolutionary rhetoric which had been the reason that everybody wanted to go to war in the first place, export the rights of man to all people, that had been laid out as the reason for war back in 1792 by Pierre Brissot and the Girondins. But this new way of exploiting all of the new conquered territories turned out to be very lucrative for France. And it made them very strong. It made them very strong as they handed themselves to Napoleon. And it's an important thing to realize that Napoleon in and of himself is a very intelligent man. Very good at not only the strategic and logistical aspect of war, but of the political nature of running a country. But he didn't build this army. He inherited Carnot's genius through the Levée en Masse and the Amalgamé. He was already militarily strong when he became effectively dictator of France. So when we last left things off on the war front, up in Belgium, General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan had just won the Battle of Fleurus in June 1794. We kind of took it right up to the edge of the Thermidorian reaction. And remember that when we talked about the Battle of Fleurus, I said he won the Battle of Fleurus, but it really was an artillery engagement largely that the Austrians just said, we don't wanna, and they withdrew. And it was an inconclusive engagement, and the concept of things like that, inclusive, decisive, that matters, but in terms of history and the way battles are documented, the winner is the person, the commander that is in charge of the field at the end of the battle. So Jourdan was in command of the field at Fleurus when the Austrians withdrew, and therefore it could be said he won the Battle of Fleurus. But after Fleurus, the Austrian and British components of the Allied army actually decided to split. They went two different directions. The Austrians headed back east toward Cologne, which you'll see is right there on the Rhine River. I had to hand draw the Rhine River in there, by the way. You're welcome, because I don't think we've actually done a good definition of where it sits geographically. But the Austrians head toward Cologne, which is one of the biggest of those German principalities that are still independent city-states that sit on the west side of the Rhine. And the British head up into what is known as the United Provinces, or we call that the Netherlands. Jourdan followed the Austrians while they pulled back toward the Rhine. He was on their heels, and he is the light blue line of advance on that map tonight. While General Jean-Charles Pichegru one of those commoner generals that was promoted by Louis Saint-Just, and he's now commander of the Army of the North. He headed up to take control of the Belgian ports along the English Channel. You'll see that line, that dark blue line, going up toward Ostend and Bruges, and then around and kind of linking up with some of the other forces at Boxtel. So after Pichegru took those ports, we're going to kind of start there with him tonight. After he kind of solidified French control of the Belgian Channel coast, he was then looking north, like more due north. And remember, General de Maurier, way back, had been forced to abandon his invasion of the Netherlands when effectively the Allies flanked behind him in the spring of 1793. But the French had always still dreamed of bringing the United Provinces into their orbit. And with the British now on the run and the Austrians not really supporting them, that dream now looked very much entirely and immediately attainable to Pichegru. So at the end of August 1794, Pichegru got the Army of the North moving. Now again, the British are up there. They're pretty much by themselves, and we'll get to where are the Prussians in a little bit. But they're up there, they're by themselves, but as a ground force, they're still in fairly decent fighting shape. But they've also just gone through a series of just morale hits. They're getting discouraged. Gilly, thank you for the resub, 21 months as well. I don't know either. Maybe it's just you subscribed at 7:12 p.m. the very first time. I don't know. But the British were getting discouraged. And we're going to cover why in a lot more depth shortly. But in short, the coalition of the major powers fighting here, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain, was starting to fracture. And the British could not convince the Austrians to hey, come back into the Netherlands to stop what's going on here. And remember why Britain got into this war. Their single major reason, the big reason the British had decided to engage on the continent proper, was because they wanted to stop the French from getting into the Netherlands and occupying it. Because there was a historic link between Britain and the Netherlands, and they just did not want the French controlling the whole Channel coast in the way they are about to. And the British just couldn't convince the Austrians, hey, this is, come help, because having the French control the entire European Channel coast is bad. The Austrians looked at that and said, why is that such a big deal to us? That's a big deal to you, because obviously it's a front that faces you. But they couldn't get it done. They couldn't convince the Austrians to come help. Austria just didn't care really about Britain's war aims. They were already abandoning their half of the Netherlands. So really, from their perspective, Mads, welcome in. So really, from the Austrian perspective,
my ears hear things in the dirtiest way possible.
So as the Austrians evaluated the British war aims, they were like, what does it matter? We're already leaving the Low Country. You probably should too, but they didn't say it like that. It just, they didn't care about why Britain was concerned here. So on September 5th, 1794, Pichegru ordered about 10,000 men up to occupy the town of Boxtel, which I've indicated it's kind of in the middle, right under the word Netherlands. And a contingent of the British army that was still there came down to block them. And this ensuing engagement, 10,000 men, 20,000, 25,000 total force on the ground. It's not a big engagement in terms of what we're talking about anymore. It wasn't a major decisive battle in and of itself. The British commander on the ground made a tactical mistake, and he actually retreated and surrendered the field to Pichegru for a victory when he should have probably advanced. But the British defeat at Boxtel was not so much a military setback as it was emotionally demoralizing, devastatingly so, for the British troops. And it gave them a final air of inevitability that the overall concept of French victory in the Netherlands was a matter of time. This is the first real fight after they come to terms with the idea that the Austrians aren't coming. And pretty soon, the British will be retreating even further north into Dutch territory, with no help coming from the Austrians. And the orders from London saying, keep up the fight. But the officers on the ground were starting to question for just how long they should really be doing that. Basically the same moment that all this is going down around Boxtel, General Jourdan was approaching the Austrian position along the Rhine, and he was about to meet with very similar success. The Austrian army was still camped pretty much outside of Cologne on the west side of the Rhine, and both of these forces were big. Jourdan's force alone was about 100,000 men, which is just dramatically larger than anything has ever been seen in warfare to this point in history. The Austrians had about 80,000 men sitting around Cologne. And on September 18th, 1794, the two sides met on a plateau near the town of Sprimont. And though the French took heavy losses, Jourdan just managed to keep pushing forward until the Austrians withdrew. And this is a byproduct of the amalgamate, because you don't have these mixed units anymore. The French still have a lot of greener recruits, but they're paired with a veteran. And the ability of the Allies to break morale, which is the point that you lose, in the French is much harder to achieve. And that is directly credit that to Lazare Carnot. It was his idea to implement it across the entire army. And then about a week later, so after Sprimont, Jourdan keeps advancing pretty much to the northeast, and another battle takes place along a long fortified line near the town of Aldenhoven. It's just only really about 30 miles west of the Rhine River. Again, Jourdan just does the same thing. He just keeps pushing. And the ability of the French to break the Austrian morale is far easier to achieve than it is for the Austrians to break the French morale. One, they're outnumbered. Two, news everywhere is that the French are steamrolling everyone and that they're not losing anywhere. And the same army had just been beaten with a hammer by Jourdan, a couple weeks earlier. So the Austrians had now clearly given up on the interior of their former province of the Austrian Netherlands, aka Belgium. But now they give up any pretense of holding the west bank of the Rhine either, and that's a big deal. Because remember, when all of this started, and Brissot was there with the Girondins pounding the drum of war, the thing that they were trying to use as the wedge was all of these German principates on the west bank of the Rhine, right where we are now, are harboring emigres. And they needed to be expelled, or the French would come basically annihilate them. And all those principates said, you got it, we'll get rid of all these people. And then the Austrians came in swinging arrogantly and said, no, we will defend them. This is the moment they stop defending them, because they can't. The Austrians retreated across the river, abandoning that little string of principates, which had been so focal to the start of all of this, and it included the major free city of Cologne. Cologne was also abandoned by the Austrians at this point. And the question becomes, why? Yes, there is the demoralizing effect of seeing what is a French onslaught coming at you, but these battles hadn't been decisive. They hadn't been decisively won by Jourdan. They had been more won by attrition. They hadn't broken through. They hadn't outflanked them. They hadn't crushed this force. They were still a very intact army, the Austrians. So why are they just simply giving it up? And this is a thing that has repeated itself so many times. Why are the Austrians just so quick to retreat? There's a very specific reason in this case. But had they wanted to, they could have dug in and fought it out on the west bank of the Rhine. And it would have been strategically more sound to do so, because then you control the bridgehead line of supply that's coming across the Rhine into Cologne instead of then fighting on the east bank. You have the benefit of the river being a natural barrier there. We're going to get into why that's not going to matter much very shortly. But it would have been strategically better for them to hold Cologne. And they just decided to say no. Gilly says, when you think you're going to lose, loss seems to be coming your way. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. To a degree. I think that's very much the case for the British, because they are outnumbered. And they are not, historically, a large-scale land-fighting force. Their strength is their navy.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
But the Austrians are. They have been dominant in Central Europe for centuries on the strength of their army. So the idea that they would just go, we're done, is interesting. Why are they just not willing to commit to the defense of Cologne, which was one of their war aims, and just give it up? I think part of it is because they believe that the Rhine River would form a natural geographic barrier between them and the French. Unfortunately for them, that's going to be nullified, hence the term winter at war. But while you're asking yourselves these questions about, hey, why are the Prussians running? The Austrians running. Ask yourself another question. Where are the Prussians, right? The last time we really talked about a Prussian force was at Dunkirk. Why have they effectively just been idle along their upper Rhine front for the better part of a year? Because there hasn't been any fighting down there. So look at where the Rhine River doesn't just keep that going down. That's where the Prussians are. The answer to both of these questions, why are the Austrians backpedaling so hard, and why are the Prussians not fighting at all, is the same answer that it turns out so often is the reason these two forces seem to be distracted during the course of the French Revolution. It's Poland. Because if you really want to understand the reasons for so many military strategic decisions during the 1790s, you really need to study the history of Poland. So we're going to do a little bit of a primer on it here tonight. Remember that there had been two partitions of Poland already, where the powers that surround them, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, had kind of decided to cut a piece up and say, that's mine now, right? They've done that twice. But Polish patriots had gone into revolt against the Russian hegemony, which had started under Catherine the Great after all these partitions of Poland that we've talked about. It's been a fair amount of time since we checked in on just what the heck is going on in Poland. But it was when Catherine the Great invaded Poland to set herself up as the hegemonic overseer of the region without actually claiming it as Russian territory after that withdrawal from the war, or the end of the war with the Ottoman Empire. When the Russians had come into Poland after the second partition, the Prussians had started to build up troops along the Polish border to their east. So again, there's Poland sitting in the middle between Russia and Prussia, with the two sides looking at each other, just basically waiting for the other to twitch. But instead of fighting, those two powers had agreed to that second Polish partition in January 1793. That left Poland this territorial just rump shadow of itself, and it was politically and socially now being dominated by Russia. But again, the Polish patriots that were still there could not stand the humiliating terms under which their government now labored after the second partition, and they spent the next year, so 1793 into 1794, kind of talking amongst themselves about how to, reverse their fortunes in an underground resistance movement. Many of these men that were in this post-second partition lead up to revolt were senior military officers, and central among them was a man named Tez Kosciuszko, who's dead center in the grid of people tonight. And Kosciuszko is a guy that, should you want to study one of those fascinating people of history, you should certainly go find books on him. But I would love, given I'm Polish and I really enjoy Polish history, I would love to spend a lot of time talking about who Kosciuszko is. But then this will become like a 4-hour episode, and I'm maybe one day we'll dedicate a little side, one of those little addendum style in between seasons episodes to who Kosciuszko is. But we're gonna give him a little bit of a primer on him. He had been Well, he had risen to prominence by volunteering for service, wait for it, in the Continental Army during the War for American Independence. Like so many other Europeans, like Lafayette, he had gone to America, not only to make a name, but to learn. He quickly became the master engineer of Continental forces fighting against the British. He was the one who fortified what is known as Bemis Heights at the pivotal turning point at the Battle of Saratoga. He's the guy that basically assured that Gates and Benedict Arnold won that. Here's another thing you don't know. Kosciuszko built West Point. Then he transferred down to the southern theater of that war, where he became General Nathaniel Greene's key lieutenant in the campaigns against Cornwallis and Tarleton. Greene's campaign against Cornwallis is what eventually boxes him in at Yorktown. And then after the war was over, Kosciuszko came home to fight a losing war, aimed at preventing the great powers that surrounded Poland from gobbling up his homeland. But to get back to it, one of the things that Russia had been up to since the second partition of Poland was systematically dismantling the Polish army. Because that's where the threat is, right? If there's an organized national military, it's still a threat to Russian hegemony over the area. So, over the winter of 1793-1794, Russia made their final move, demanding that the Polish army be reduced in size from 50,000 standing troops to just 15,000. This was the intolerable moment for all of these Polish patriot officers who had kind of been murmuring in their underground, because they were actually planning on using this 50,000 troop army to expel the Russians when the moment was right. So with this demobilization order coming down from Catherine the Great, Kosciuszko and these other officers, they realized they had to do something now or it was never. So in March 1794, as we ran through the spring of the Great Terror and the death of the indulgence and the ultras over in Poland, Kosciuszko is announcing a general insurrection from his base in Krakow. And the Poles were initially successful. They whipped the Russian force that was sent to just stomp them on April 4th. And then they started to move from Krakow to Warsaw, which is the capital of Poland. During this Polish patriot advance, it was helped by a spontaneous uprising in the capital itself that saw residents of Warsaw, without the support of the army, slaughter at least half of the 5,000-man Russian garrison that was in the city. And now, clearly looking to emulate the French Revolution, the Polish patriots actually sang La Marseillaise in Polish. They set up Jacobin-style political clubs to support their insurrection. And in May 1794, Kosciuszko unilaterally declared freedom for all Polish serfs, which was effectively their attempt to end feudalism as had been done by the French at the turn of the 1790s. But really what he was trying to do was duplicate Carnot's mass mobilization effort. Here's your freedom. Come, fight for it. And you can parallel that to Ukraine today, by the way. The unrest caused by what is known historically as Kosciuszko's uprising presented the main reason for the Prussians and the Austrians to get so distracted from the West. As the summer of 1794 went on, Kosciuszko's uprising was happening on their eastern flank, with Russia staring down on them, sending more and more troops into Poland to deal with it. And all of a sudden, the reason for the partition, that to create a buffer while they all, got a little bit of territory, that buffer was disappearing. So they were all going, uh-oh, France is winning here and there, but Russia's a much bigger problem. But with Catherine the Great's blessing, and this is how smart she was, she decided that maybe I don't have to commit as many troops into stomping what's going on in Poland, and she gave her blessing for the Prussians to move into Poland, with aims of the Prussian army taking Warsaw. But then also, with Catherine the Great's blessing, and unbeknownst to the Prussians, the Austrians also sent a force into Poland with the aim of taking Warsaw. So she's letting her rivals do her work for her. And with the military and political gravity of the Eastern powers now revolving around Poland, Prussia then went from, kind of calculated inaction against the French to actively sending peace feelers to Paris in October 1794. So as we've gone into the Thermidorian Convention, Prussia's very quietly saying, hey, we'd like out of this war, please. Those peace feelers would eventually result in Prussia leaving this anti-French coalition, the army of the War of the First Coalition. Prussia will depart it very shortly in the spring of 1795. Gilly says, it sounds like she wants the Prussians and Austrians to destroy each other and the Polish, and she'll pick over the carcasses like a vulture. It's fair. At least weaken. Let the Prussians and Austrians get weaker fighting Poland instead of letting Russia get weaker fighting Poland, right? It's not stupid at all. Unfortunately for Poland here, the weight of the three territorial hungry great power neighbors around them was just too much. In October, the army that Kosciuszko led was defeated by the Russians. Kosciuszko himself was captured, and at the time of his capture, he famously said, quote, "This is the end of Poland." And he would be proven prophetic, because by the end of all of this partitioning of Poland, Poland will cease to be a thing at all until after the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. On November the 4th, the Russians beat the last major Polish force outside Warsaw, and when the Russians entered the capital, they did so with an eye for revenge. The troops themselves were let off the leash, which is the phrase to say discipline was not a thing. They were allowed to loot, pillage, kill, rape as they saw fit. It is estimated that 20,000 Poles were killed in the indiscriminate massacre that followed that fall of Warsaw. And the reason the Russians were wanting to get revenge is because they wanted revenge for those 5,000 Russian troops which were massacred by that initial uprising. And to give perspective on this, with respect to the Great Terror, more Poles died in this single day or two period than were executed officially during the entire year of the Reign of Terror. With the Poles beaten militarily, it was up to the occupying powers to decide what they were going to do. Prussia, Austria, and Russia. It took a while to kind of work it out, but they just decided, hey, let's just at this point divide up what's left of Poland. And the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians met for a diplomatic summit about a year later, in October 1795, to haggle over all their respective territorial claims of what is about to formerly be Poland. And then finally, after about a year and a half of haggling, in January 1797, they signed the Third Polish Partition, which obliterates Poland from the maps of Europe for 123 years. This is why the Austrians are really not so committed to fighting along the Rhine anymore, because their war aim is, do we care as much about holding territory west of the Rhine? Evening, Archie. Do we care about holding territory so much that's west of the Rhine, or do we really, really need to be more focused on what's going on in Poland? The Prussians, for sure, they weren't fighting a fight anyway. The French weren't even advancing on them, so they were absolutely going, well, let's deal with what's going on back in our east, and at the same time say, hey, we're not fighting anyway. Let's end our hostilities. So, while the Eastern powers turned their attention to Poland in 1794, the British were just kind of left to carry out a very frustrating defense of the Netherlands all by themselves once the winter of 1794 set in, right? And normally, winter is when these ground campaigns kind of pause, right? You've heard the term winter quarters. Okay, here's a good question before we get into it. You say the Treaty of Versailles brought Poland back. Why reincorporate a nation that hadn't existed for over a century? Well, the World War I will explain this, but the idea of having these Eastern European buffer states to keep the bigger dogs away from each other is actually a good thing. One of the major reasons that there was such a quick domino effect into World War I was because the Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russians and the French were so close to each other, right? In the French, German, and Austrian case, they basically touched each other. But there was Belgium there, right? There was Switzerland. There was the Alps between France and Germany. Between Germany and Russia, there wasn't a whole lot at the time the war broke out. Like the idea of Poland and the Ukraine, and we talked about, you showed that map of, 1914 Russia last week. There is no Ukraine and Poland there, right? It's just Russia. Russia runs all the way up to basically Denmark. The idea of reestablishing, no, that's a good question. The idea of reestablishing these buffer states between bigger powers is actually a preventative measure against war. Now, it doesn't work, obviously, because Hitler couldn't care less about whether Poland, what Poland's purpose was. But that's why it was recreated. Plus, maybe it was the right thing to do after a cultural heritage had been annihilated a century earlier. I think time and time again in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, history proves that these people give a crap about their ethnic heritage and they're willing to fight for it. Ukraine's fighting for it right now. So gobbling them up and throwing an umbrella over them to say you're all just now Russians or you're all just now Germans doesn't work out very well long term. Long term stability, especially post Cold War stability, was achieved because these states existed until like 3 weeks ago. But the point is that, one, it was the right thing to do in an era of post-World War I attempts to do the right thing. By the way, the failure to do this at the end of World War I, Vietnam petitioned for the same release from France colonialism, and the League of Nations said, and because of that, there was a Vietnam War. But it is the idea of self-determination what was one of the lofty goals at the end of World War I. And the people of Poland were self-determining that they wanted Poland back. So again, as the Eastern powers were really focused on Poland, no problem, Gilly. I'm happy to explain it. That's why we do this live, so that the things I don't write down can be asked. But while the Eastern powers were looking over at Poland in 1794, the British were, again, left to carry out this very frustrating defense of the Netherlands, all by themselves once the winter of 1794 set in. And, again, under normal circumstances, when winter comes in this, flintlock rifle era of warfare, that tends to be the time when the campaign pauses for the year. When it starts snowing, that's like, maybe it's time to go into winter quarters because the logistics become difficult. It's just horrible for morale, and everyone just kind of goes in. Valley Forge's winter quarters, really bad winter quarters, but that's the idea. They would just go and kind of park until winter broke, and the ground softened and all that water kind of got back into the ground. It wasn't muddy anymore. That's really why it was done. Logistically, it was a nightmare to move in winter. Yeah, it was standby. They went to a standby phase. But the winter of 1794-1795 turned out to be like one of the worst winters on record. Even colder and more miserable than the winter of 1788-1789, which really added fuel to that fire of initial French resentment leading into the Estates General. What this means practically, and it was like the worst winter of the 18th century. What this means practically is that every river in Northern Europe froze solid. The Rhine, the Wall, the Meuse, they're all frozen. So when we talked about, hey, maybe the Austrians decided to go back across the Rhine River because they could defend against the choke point at the Cologne bridgehead, it's not that much of a choke point anymore if the French army can just walk across the entirely frozen river. Yeah, it's not much of a natural barrier anymore, exactly. And recognizing this opportunity, General Pichegru pretty much looked at his men and said, hey, this winter's really bad, but let's just keep on fighting. Because they were actually able to march across these frozen rivers wherever they felt like it, and not be reliant on using the choke points at the bridgeheads all over the Low Country, because you have to remember that a lot of the Belgian and Netherlands is below sea level. So where it was marshy and you had to use these bridges to make these crossings, which were much more defensible places for the British to concentrate, now the French could just walk across. And this allowed the French army to march almost entirely unopposed toward the Dutch capital of Amsterdam. So we're going to take our first break, and we're going to talk about the frozen rivers and how it affected the campaign, and we're going to get into a thing, I'm not making this up, I can find no other, and I'm aware of no other time this specific combination of things happened ever in a battle. Singularly unique thing happens at the port city of Den Helder. So hang out, because it's actually really cool. Like, you have never heard of anything like this happening before. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Get a drink. Go to the bathroom. If you're watching on YouTube, thanks for hanging out. You can fast forward probably 2 minutes. And I'll be back in just a few.
Hey, Jeff. This is in the wild schedule.
She's fine, Gilly. I don't call it lurkers, but she's here. She's fine. Just to put that fear to rest, she's doing fine. She's in the background. Hi, Rocket. Not to call you out. Continue to feel free lurking, but Gilly was concerned, so I would say that I can see you. Well, welcome back. Don't forget that we've changed our focus here. With everything that's going on in Ukraine, we're not donating. Sorry, I mean, I don't want to call you out, but Gilly didn't leave me. He left me in a position where he's worried about you. You know, it's not like you to miss, etc. And I was like, I can see her. I might as well let him know that his friend is, here. But don't forget, we've changed our focus right now. All the bit subs and Streamlit stuff that you buy will be donated to Ukrainian Red Cross efforts instead of DAV for a while. So bear that in mind. Again, just donate directly. I would prefer you donate directly. You don't have to put the money to me, but those of you who are subbed, that's where your money is going. We've already donated $170 to the Red Cross in Ukraine. We're going to donate this month as well. Good point, Doc. Excuse me. But Pisha Grew sees an opportunity here.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
As the rivers freeze during this really, really horrible winter of 1794, 1795. And he decides that he's not going into winter quarters. He decides he's going to use the frozen rivers as a line of advance instead of going over the bridges. This allowed, again, the French to march to Amsterdam pretty much unopposed. So if you're looking at where we are on the map here, we talked about the advance to Boxtel. I'm sorry it gets kind of pixelated here, but that's just the resolution. The Wall River is the big river that they were able to just go, we don't need to use the bridges. And they went right across the river. Jourdan's going to do the same thing on the Rhine. I zoom back out and try to make sure it's all centered again, which it's not. So here goes Pisha Grew, moving toward Amsterdam. As the French moved north into the Low Country, they enjoyed the privilege of actually being greeted as liberators. For a quick primer on Dutch history, by the end of the 18th century, the Dutch government was, for all intents and purposes, a dynastic oligarchy that was run by the House of Orange. This had been an ever-building state of affairs in the Netherlands since William of Orange had stood up in opposition to the territorial ambitions of Louis XIV. But in practical terms, the Netherlands had evolved under this Orangist oligarchy into not much more than a satellite state of the British government, given that the House of Orange actually has a hereditary tie into the British royal family and the assistance that the British government had given William of Orange at the power of his rise, and then the Netherlands had kind of bound them together. This is why, really, on top of, hey, we don't want the French to control the channel, that the British were invested in the Netherlands. So a lot of native Dutch were really excited about the idea that the French were, coming to liberate them from these conditions under the Orangists, because they had heard all that lofty rhetoric about let's export the rights of man to all people who want it. Because of the advancing French army under Pisha Grew, a citizen uprising actually occurred in Amsterdam prior to their arrival that ousted the Orangist government, just as kind of the French appeared on the horizon. Orange just made me think of Neon Orange. William of Orange is an interesting guy, too. He would be considered, in my mind, the nemesis of Louis XIV. These newly, ordained Dutch leaders in Amsterdam that had now kind of taken over the city, they then welcomed the approaching French army with open arms and said, hey, come on in. And Pisha Grew entered Amsterdam on January the 19th, 1795. Look how quick 1794 went, by the way. Remember how many episodes 1793 was? We covered 1794, and like once we got to the Thermidor interaction, it was like, boom, done. And here we are already talking about 1795. A few days after Pichegru captured Amsterdam, he learned that up at the port of Den Helder, which is interesting because if you look at that dark green that kind of sits to its east, that actually floods a lot. That's actually ocean a lot of the time. I kind of assumed 1795 wasn't going to happen. But that area on the map is a flood. It's a floodplain, and it's oftentimes just ocean. But Pichegru realized that up at this port of Den Helder, which when that is flooded is much more of a peninsula, a Dutch fleet of 14 ships was there. And because of the harshness of the winter, they'd actually been frozen. The ocean around Den Helder was frozen, and these ships were stuck in their harbor. So Pichegru, no escape. Here's the interesting part. Here's the thing that's never happened before. And since Pichegru said, hey, let's take a piece of our army and send it up there, and let's see if this is actually what's going on, because it's like, what? They investigated it. And I said, yeah, there's 14 Dutch ships stuck up in the harbor. They can't move. And on January 23rd, Pichegru ordered his French cavalry to launch a surprise attack on the ships stuck in the ice. He ordered them to charge across the ice at the ships. So imagine this. There are ships that cannot move, stuck in the ice. A rolling hill goes down into this ice plain that's supposed to be the ocean. And here comes mounted horsemen of the French army charging at the hulls of tall ships. Yep, a cavalry charge against naval vessels. The French were successful. They captured not only the 14 Dutch ships so that they could then incorporate them into the French Navy, but also the 850 heavy guns that those ships held in their holds. What's up, Diggity? Welcome in. They captured not only the 14 ships, but the 850 guns, the heavy guns, that these ships had in their holds and on their gun mounts. And again, I've looked at this event in history for a long time, because it's one of those, moments. People say, and can find no evidence to contradict it, this is the only time in military history that a fleet has been captured by a cavalry charge. But it's subjective, right? We don't know if that's for sure. If anybody has, I'm really interested in this. If anybody has, whether it's, letting me know in Discord or letting me know in YouTube comments, if anybody has knowledge of any other time that a cavalry charge occurred against a fleet, I want to read about it. Yeah, you have to know his troops were kind of like, they're like Merlin in Top Gun. You want us to do what? It's one of those, I wish there was a painting of it, because it's one of those interesting moments in history. Like, wouldn't that look awesome on the wall? I like tall ships for starters, and I like cavalry. I think the entire concept of this coming together is entirely just interesting. Evening Kays, welcome in. Hopefully you're still enjoying Elden Ring, my friend. Kays is playing Elden Ring on PC for anybody that is interested in maybe doing some co-op shenanigans, some jolly cooperation with him. So here we are, though, right? We're way up north in the Netherlands now. Pichegru is winning everywhere, and the French are completely ascendant in the Low Country. Perhaps it's a case of frozen paint. Can't make a painting of it. I wish I could find a painting of it. I'd buy a print. But here we are. The French are completely ascendant in the Netherlands, and the British are now withdrawing further to the northeast into Hanoverian territory, which later on would become part of Germany. The British force then kind of sat there waiting for the government back in London to, recognize what the army already understood, that continuing to wage a land war against the French when the French were this big, this strong, and this unstoppable was just suicide. Fortunately, come the spring of 1795, William Pitt the Younger ordered the British to evacuate the continent. Meaning get the army off of continental Europe. One, they don't have the support of their allies at all, and two, they're just getting the crap pasted out of them now. But the British were not abandoning the war. But having failed to achieve their one strategic objective on land, which was deny France the Netherlands, they decided to now focus their efforts on the sea, where the British Navy was likely to have far more success because it was the largest and the best navy in the world at the time. It would be the largest and best navy in the world all the way up to World War II. And as an aside here, if you're familiar with the film Master and Commander or the Jack Aubrey novels that make up his story, which are like 24, this is the period in history that is being described in those novels all the way into the Napoleonic conflicts. It's this period where the Jack Aubrey character, kind of gets the narrative context of the British being completely dedicated to only a naval conflict with France. But as it turned out, the British had really lost their one strategic objective on the continent. The Netherlands will remain in the French orbit of control now until the fall of Napoleon, meaning well into the 18 teens. The Allies are not going to come back into the Netherlands. Now, the day that the French entered Amsterdam, when Pichegru was greeted with open arms by the new civic leaders of Amsterdam who had ousted the Orangists, the Dutch leaders had proclaimed themselves to be, quote, the Batavian Republic. Now, the Batavian part comes from a Dutch nationalist tradition that traced its ethnic roots back to the Bataviae, who were one of those Gallic tribes that occupied this geographic region when this area was known as Gaul under the Romans. These are the same Gallic barbarians that are popularly depicted as the enemies of Rome on the west side of the Rhine. And these are some of the same Gallic people which Julius Caesar just crushed in the years before he crossed the Rubicon, ending the Roman Republic. And the Dutch were pretty excited about being liberated. But they soon discovered that the freedom and independence that they thought they were going to get were not what the French had in mind at all. Again, far from the lofty idealism of 1792, Paris was not even remotely interested in exporting the revolution in the name of freedom, liberty, and national self-determination. It was interested in creating client states, which is something that Napoleon's going to do as well. And these client states would exist to serve the military and economic needs of France. This run of victories in 1794 that culminated with the permanent, until 1814, occupation of the Netherlands, and all of those wealthy principates along the Rhine River as well, will have a whole lot to do with stabilizing a domestic economy in France at the expense of all of these territories. Now, the domestic economy in France, we have talked about being a problem since the 1780s, right? It's the reason the revolution got going. The reason the church was nationalized. So with all that in mind, let's pivot away from the war. And let's talk about the domestic French economy, which had kind of just been doing okay during 1794, but had started to again trend in a bad direction by the end of the year, when then it was clobbered by one of the worst winters of the century. Now, one of the leading indicators, and we haven't talked about this in a long time, one of the leading indicators of the health and stability of the French economy was the value of the assignat. Now remember, the assignat was a bond that was originally backed by that seized portion of nationalized church property, which was then in turn sold at auction. After all hell had broken loose, in the spring of 1793, the value of the assignat had plunged all the way down to 22% of its face value, because the pre-Thermidorian convention had effectively just started to try to print its way into solvency to prosecute all of these wars. They were just printing paper in order to pay for things. Again, let me do this. You gotta love the fact now that because bots cannot message me in my channel because they're not verified, they're whispering me. So let's do this real quick. As an aside, to take care of that problem. I'm not interested in buying followers or viewers. I just want people here that want to learn history. But they are beginning to whisper you. Yep, anything to get their message out there. Crazy. Yep. I just saw it pop up over there and I figured I'd let you guys know. But, again, the French were trying, the pre-Thermidorian Convention plunged the value of the assignat to about 22% face value because they were just printing paper. Now, modern inflationary theory, which we're all facing as a real consequence of everything right now, hadn't really evolved yet. Adam Smith hadn't really finished the concept of economics. So they just thought more paper in the hands of people meant more ability to purchase. But it caused the value of what was the accepted face value of the assignat to be about 1/5 of what it actually was worth. Because printing money without something to back it gets into that whole relationship of trust of currency that we spoke about last week. The collapse of the assignat due to this inflation, among other causes, is why the convention had been so willing to invest even more power in the strong executive committee of public safety. Yeah, you can't just invent money out of thin air. It's weird. Unless you're, a corporation on Wall Street. One of the signature accomplishments of this Committee of Public Safety had been to kind of stabilize the declining value of the assignat as they rolled into 1794 and then strengthen its paper face value at least for a little while. When the committee really took over in earnest in 1793 in August, the value of the assignat kind of started to inch back up a little bit. This process was given a forcible nudge when the general maximum, remember what the general maximum is that this is the list of what you are allowed to price your goods at. This is the maximum price you are allowed to sell at nationwide. And that gave the value of the assignat a boost. The price controls and the takeover of the economic supply chain that was a part of the general maximum really started to strengthen the value of the assignat. Then, over the winter of 1793 into 1794, the Committee of Public Safety stumbled into an inflation control measure really by accident when they demanded a forced loan from the rich. Now remember, there had been loans from the rich that had happened under the ancien regime. And the Committee of Public Safety just kind of went back to it, except they weren't saying, hey, we really like this. They were saying, you're going to do this or lose your head. Now this forced loan from the rich was determined by a sliding scale based on your total wealth. And the loan that was going to come in from all these rich people was supposed to help generate revenue. But the government really had no choice but to accept payments of the loan in assignat as a valid form of payment. And they accepted it at its face value, not at its depreciated value of 1/5. So naturally, everybody who was being forced into, a forced loan said, I can pay 20% of what I really should be paying here as long as I pay the government in the assignat. And so they were just throwing worthless piles of the assignat back at the government. No, it actually was a good thing. The forced loan didn't generate the real revenue that the Committee of Public Safety was hoping for. That's the thing. Gilly's got it. All that inflated printing that had been going on to pay for the war, all of those assignats were now coming back off the streets and into the hands of the government, removing the inflationary catalyst. So the forced loan started to chip away at the inflated currency problem and raise the value of the assignats that were still in circulation because the paper itself was rarer. Soon enough, after this forced loan period, the value of the Océan was back up and trading at about 50% of face value. And that's a pretty remarkable recovery for a currency that didn't really have that much backing it and how poor it had been. Now, it's going to not stay there. The longer the general maximum stayed in effect, the harder it became to enforce. And the enforcement was, you will sell no higher than these prices or else. The heavy-handed enforcement mechanism of the or else was the Great Terror. Outside the war zones of the Federalist uprising cities in the Vendée, violation of the general maximum was the source of the most denunciations of the Great Terror. Like price gouging was the source of the single biggest source of the denunciations of the Great Terror, outside of those areas that were in revolt. It was also the source of the most non-political executions. So as we kind of talked about, we went through this whole period of 1793, which was really long, and people were losing their heads, and we talked about all these political killings, but the bulk of the people who were executed were not political killings, and the bulk of those people were executed for this reason, for violating the general maximum. So the Great Terror served as the compliance stick for the general maximum. But the Committee of Public Safety was not so insensible to the complaints that one standard list of prices for the entire country made no sense. And back in February 1794, they issued a revised price list. And it was one that took into account regional differences and factored in transportation of cost to market. And still, for the first half of 1794, the choice for farmers, traders, merchants, and wholesalers was sell your goods and services at the ruinous rates of the general maximum or get your head chopped off. But then the terror was abandoned. And the whip, in a post-Thermidorian reaction economic state, that whip was removed. There was no longer a stick to force people to comply with the maximum. And very predictably, the real market for goods was disengaged from the official market for goods. Now, we normally would call something like this a black market, right? Where you don't go to Walmart to get the thing, you go to the underground website to get the thing. But this is a situation where everything was only available on the black market. So it was, in fact, the market, however unofficial it may have been. And as the general maximum broke down, the value of the Océan then plunged back down to about 20% of its value again by the end of 1794. Now, ironically enough, just as the people of Paris were starting to suspect that the general maximum, Gilly says, think modern computer components. You might find them for MSRP, but you can find them scalped freaking anywhere. Yep, that's a black market. Scalping, in my opinion, is a black market. You're not buying from a licensed wholesaler. You're not buying from the provider. You're buying from an intermediate third party who's taken it on and said, I'm going to change the fair market value of this in an unofficial way. Scalping of PS5s is definitely that sort of thing. So ironically, just as the people of Paris were starting to really suspect that the general maximum was broken and unenforceable, the National Convention said, yeah, let's keep those around for another year. Now, the post-Thermidorian National Convention was doing this to shore up their left flank, right? They were saying, this is about the same time they were putting Marat in the Pantheon. They were trying to make sure that they were not doing things to create more insurrectionary uprisings from the radical left. And the maximum had been put in place because of the demands of the radical left. But then, the convention's agents and spies in the capital reported that people in general were starting to really believe that the maximum was doing more harm than good. Nothing was available at the actual list price of the maximum. And there was no longer a mechanism to force people to comply. And obviously, to a lot of convention delegates, this was absolutely music to their ears. For them, the maximum had always been a terrible economic idea. And remember, they're enlightened free marketers, most of them. Well, they'd only done this because Robespierre kind of forced them to, in order to remove the enragé sans-culotte threat in September of 1793. It had always just been a political expedient to prevent uprising. If the word on the street was now that the people of Paris were sick of the maximum, the convention was all about getting France back on, the enlightened free market, because that's where they had wanted to go in the first place. So the convention orders an investigation into the continued efficacy of the general maximum. And that report came back really quickly and said, it's not working, so, let's get rid of it. And so on December 24th, 1794, the National Convention repealed the general maximum and let the free market have its day. Well, this isn't the first time that the free market has, there's been an attempt to have its day in France, and it was attempted under the Ancien regime a couple of times. But don't forget what's going to happen with the weather, which had been a reason in the past why these attempts at free marketing also failed. Because as luck would have it, for all of the French free market enthusiasts during the revolutionary period and the pre-revolutionary period, they abolished the maximum just as Europe was headed into one of its worst winters on record. Now, the harvest of 1794 had been fine, right? Not great by any stretch. The French had been forced to import some grain from North America, and that shipment of grain, by the way, had actually been in the middle of a pretty major naval battle in June 1794 as the British tried to stop the convoy of grain from reaching France. And that battle was technically won by the British because they forced the French fleet to retreat, but the grain went through anyway. They got it through anyway. The battle took so long that the supply ships made it through while the actual combat ships were fighting. And so, France really won that battle, even though the French Navy was in retreat at the end of it.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
But even with this grain shipment bolstering the not-so-bad harvest of 1794, two things conspired over the winter of 1794 and into 1795 to make things simply terrible for the average French consumer yet again. First, the army requisitioners for this now massive army had first dibs on all commodities they required. 750,000 men were under arms in the French army at this point, and that is a lot of mouths to feed. So you can take that right off the top of the supply available of all commodities on the public market. Then, of course, the winter froze all the rivers, which not only ground the internal transportation system to a halt, because it's really hard to get around in the winter for the average French person, but more importantly, all those grain mills that need the water to turn. We talked about drought. Yep, there it is. Gilly's got it again. Drought had caused a problem before. Now frozen rivers mean those wheels aren't turning. And with no running water to make the grain mills function, it meant that even if you had a stockpile of harvested grain straight from the field, you couldn't turn it into anything edible. So just as the maximum was being lifted, the supply of everything plummeted, and the price of everything skyrocketed. Prices for commodities quickly turned into a place that was well beyond what the poorer Parisians could afford. And in January 1795, over this winter, this horrible winter, people were literally dropping dead of starvation in the streets of cities all over France. So, of course, in their wisdom to compensate for the lack of purchasing power of the French citizens, the convention, then again, ramped up printing of the assignat so people could buy food. But this again led to the very predictable, in retrospect, inflation, compounded by the fact that there was no longer a hint of a bluff that the assignat currency was really being backed by anything. Again, remember the assignat started out being based on, a claim on property being expropriated from the Catholic Church when all of its lands had been nationalized in the early days of the National Assembly. And then over the years, various French national governments had tried to keep up with the number of assignats in circulation by targeting and seizing émigré property. And people who had left France, they started seizing in estates and land, and that was also being auctioned. But at this moment, in the early months of 1795, there's nothing new that the government can stake the value of the assignat to, and everybody knew it. As the paper printing of the assignat flew new notes off the press, hyperinflation began to take hold. And hyperinflation is a term we'll come back to again in the Weimar Republic in post-World War I Germany. At the start of spring 1795, the assignat, which had been back to a height of 50% face value under the Committee of Public Safety and the General Maximum, had plummeted down to 20% under the Thermidorian Convention, was now only trading at 8% face value. This is a crippling lack of faith in the value of a currency. It can be relatively compared to the crippling lack of faith trying to be generated in the ruble right now in Russia. When there is no faith in the value of the currency becomes worthless. This lack of faith in the assignat in the spring of 1795 killed the assignat. It was effectively dead as a mode of commerce. We'll get into what replaces it down the road. When you need a wheelbarrow full of money to buy bread, your country has very serious problems. Exactly that. When you have all the assignat you could ever need, but you have to carry it, in a wagon to buy a loaf of bread, there's a problem. And people are not going to maintain confidence in a currency that requires that volume of paper to buy basics. So the economic crisis in Paris that ensued over the winter was of course met with unrest in the streets. Predictably justified unrest in the streets, even though they were okay with, largely removing the maximum. It was just, again, crappy timing for the free market. But it also is illustrative of the volatility of the free market, because these things happen all the time. We're paying $5 plus for gas right now. I'm fine with that because of why we're doing it. But the free market supply and demand and speculation all causes all of these things to happen, these wild ups and downs of the purchasing power of the people. But there was, in this instance in France, also a genuine clash of interests out there. And the newly conservative Thermidorian Convention was, willing to accept the help of just about anybody who would beat down the radical left. Yeah, at least they're not having to deal with the complete utter failure of their just-in-time logistics like we are. But the convention was willing to say, yeah, anybody want to go out there and deal with that unrest? Well, it doesn't really matter. We'll back you if you're just willing to do the work. And thus, the Muscadins, the Gilded Youth, began to roam the streets of Paris with even greater impunity. We talked about the Muscadins last week. They are the return to kind of revenge themselves more affluent youth of the country who had now gone out there to beat down anybody who had been, they didn't really like radicals and the people that had been mean to them or throwing them in jail during the terror. But they started to push their way into theaters and close down plays they didn't like. If the Gilded Youth spotted someone wearing, ye old red cap of liberty out there on the street, they would then beat them down with their constitutions, their sticks. They even went so far as to attack anyone singing La Marseillaise, which the Muscadins denounced as a Jacobin anthem. Maybe that's true, considering that it was kind of a Jacobin anthem, calling for blood and everything. Go look at the words. But the Muscadins also went around to all of the de-Christianized churches. Remember, de-Christianization had kind of taken hold, and they started to de-Christianize them. Many of those active de-Christianizers who had been taking down the iconography of the Christian church were acolytes. Yeah, I like de-Christianizing better, though, Turius. But many of the original de-Christianizers were acolytes of John Paul Marat. And so when they had gone into the churches and removed the Christian iconography, crucifixes and such, they had actually replaced those icons with busts of Jean Paul Marat. Whereas the cult of Marat comes from. This all culminated. Well, the Muscadins loved, by the way, going into churches with their constitutions and swinging for the fences at the busts of Jean Paul Marat. And this is one of those, we don't really like Jean Paul Marat, right? I mean, he's a bloodthirsty psychopath. So these guys going into these churches and smashing busts of him with sticks, I like that idea. But I don't like the idea of who's doing it, right? The Muscadins are not good people either. It's one of those two evils type of things, which will have a repetitive theme as we go through the annals of history. But all of this culminated in February 1795, when, under pressure from the Muscadins, the convention voted to remove Marat from the Pantheon. He'd only been interred there for 5 months. That was all the time Jean-Paul Marat ever spent in the French Pantheon, which you can still go visit today. Now, the beleaguered leftist, populist, sans-culotte Jacobins, they attempted to rally around the nucleus of another popular movement that got going in 1795, when an obscure lawyer named François-Noël Babeuf, it's a great name, started to anonymously publish a paper called The Tribune of the People. Now, anybody who studied Roman history should have just perked up, because it's important to note that the term Tribune of the People here is being used in its literal Roman Republican sense, where the Tribune of the People in Rome was the elected representative of the plebeians, the lower caste class, who could propose legislation and veto legislation from the Roman Senate. Take that concept in. You have what could be deemed to be the Senate in the convention. And now you have a paper being anonymously published by someone under the banner Tribune of the People, which anybody with an education in France at the time understood that context, that here is someone who is basically suggesting, I have the power to veto and propose legislation or concepts to the convention, suggesting a better form of government. Yeah, all kinds of things. The name matters. We've talked about this a lot during the French Revolution, where people, and I talked about this last night, I find it very interesting that, if you go talk to an everyday person on the street and you say the name Gaius Marius, they don't know who that is. Hugely important person in history, by the way. Hugely important history. Even if you say, what is Julius Caesar being famous for? A lot of people say, oh, he was the first emperor of Rome. Nope. He was not the first emperor of Rome. Augustus Caesar was. My point is that there is a detachment in the modern sense of people, everyday people, from the past. 200 years ago, that wasn't true. Most people, if you said Tribune of the People, knew what that meant in context from 2,000 years earlier. This paper, The Tribune of the People, helped launch a slogan which we'll cover as a focus next episode. This slogan that the Tribune of the People got into the minds of the people of France is bread and the Constitution of 1793. Two demands. One, obviously bread, because they're all starving. Hey, whatever happened to the Constitution of 1793 that the Committee of Public Safety said we couldn't implement right now because of all the emergencies that don't exist anymore? it becomes a rallying cry. And we're going to talk about it a lot next week. But for the left, the tide really had turned against them. Government censors came swooping down, even though, Jean-Lambert Tallien had been out there saying everybody has the right to print and say whatever they want. Government censors came swarming down on the Tribune of the People and shut down its ability to be distributed and then printed when they figured out that Babeuf was behind it. Babeuf got arrested before the paper could really get going. But for Francois-Noël Babeuf, this was only the beginning of his radical career, and he will soon return back into our story under his more famous name, Gracchus Babeuf. Now again, the name Gracchus, which is the name he adopts, is a direct reference to Roman history. It references the two famous Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who showed ambitious Roman politicians the way forward through populism. They were both, wait for it, tribunes of the people. They showed others, like Gaius Marius and Julius Caesar, how to be anti-establishment populists as a mechanism to power. The Gracchi brothers used populist appeals to usurp and upend the Roman establishment, eventually leading to the end of the Roman Republic as Marius, Sulla, and the Julius Caesar era broke the entire system down. But it starts with Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Gracchus Babeuf will use this call to Roman antiquity to style himself as the modern tribune of the French people down the road. There is a lot of ties to Roman history here, but it again, to your other comment, it saddens me that people don't know some of these things. The French people did. One, it's more in their backyard. France was Gaul, conquered by Rome. But the history was known to them. Gracchus Babeuf knew that if he called himself tribune of the people, the French people would know what he meant. So we'll take our second break here as we bring things in for a landing. With Gracchus Babeuf, Francois-Noël Babeuf, being arrested for publishing the Tribune of the People, but he's not done. And the call for bread and the Constitution of 1793, keep it in your mind, because it's going to be a rallying cry that we talk a lot about next week for a bunch of reasons. We're going to take a step back. I'm going to finish up the episode after a break. We're going to come back down and talk about the big wedge issue that has been dominating the French Revolution since the beginning. Most of you should know what that is. If you don't, you'll find out in just a few minutes. Thank you for hanging out tonight, everybody. Hopefully you're having fun, enjoying the episode, learning some stuff, and I'll talk to you all in a few minutes. Get up, walk around, get a drink, go to the bathroom, all that stuff. We'll be back in a few.
Let's rock!
Welcome back. I decided to do something during the break. If that stuff about Rome perked your ears, or you said, no, I don't know about that, I grabbed the cover from Dan Carlin's Death Throes of the Republic series. I know Doc has listened to it. Dustin and Diggity, I think, have all kind of gone through it in their own ways, either through Carlin or Mike Duncan. But it's one of the, Carlin's podcast series is one that he wrote. Like, as it continues, he takes back episodes off from the free tier, right, where you go pay for it. It's $12.99 for what, 5 episodes. That's the link to it. It's great. It's absolutely a fantastic subject. Mike Duncan also has a book on this topic called Storm Before the Storm, which is really good. Both of these, Death Throes of the Republic is probably, I would say, what, 4 plus 4, about 8-hour investment. You don't need to understand the structure of the Roman Republic because he's going to explain it to you, and it's really fascinating. Duncan's book is outstanding. Covers the same topic in depth. Both the same topic is also covered in Mike Duncan's History of Rome podcast. I get that Roman history is intimidating because it's so long, right? You're talking over basically 800 to 1,000 years of Roman history if you really want to go deep into the empire. And once you get past, I would say, Trajan, it starts to get really confusing, especially where does the bridge between Rome and the Byzantines, really, where's the line? But this era, this last 100 years of the Roman Republic, if you get into it, you're also going to get into a place in your head where you're like, wow, a lot of that stuff seems to be happening today. Just keeping up with the many emperor names is daunting. Yes, it is, especially when they stop to be basically Spanish and Italian and they become German. But, again, this specific era, basically 150 BC to about 40 BC, is really, really, really interesting. And given that the United States is patterned after the Roman Republic, it's interesting to go through the parallels. And all the stuff I just mentioned, names like, the Gracchi brothers and Gaius Marius, who is one of those you admire and loathe people at the same time, and Sulla and Julius Caesar, who's very fascinating. All really, really interesting. Additionally, Dan Carlin has an episode called the Celtic Holocaust, which is about Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, which we also talked about tonight. So that one I think is still free or maybe on its way out very soon. But if any of this perked your ear from the Roman perspective, it's not as daunting as you think if you pick a specific period. The people who are writing and speaking on these topics tend to give you the backstory, especially Duncan and Dan Carlin. So I would really look into it because it is really fascinating history. Or it could be like Fix and have the 7 volumes of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire on your shelf, and then that's nuts reading. But it's all interesting stuff. All especially paralleling modern society. Yeah, it's worth a listen. You want to see one of those books? They're really cool. While we're on the topic, I have acquired there are 7 volumes this size in this reading, and Gibbon is verbose on the subject. It is a topic that you really, really have to love if you're going to read into Gibbon. Yeah, it's great. I love owning those. But in a shorter form, again, if you're interested in Caesar, The War in Gaul is written in his hand. It's one of the oldest manuscripts written by a commanding general of a major campaign that exists in history. It's propaganda as well as letters of conquest back to Rome, and it's fascinating. Much shorter read. And it's also one of the primary sources that Dan Carlin uses to talk about the Celtic Holocaust episode. I digress. I wanted to take the opportunity because we just talked about how the French know at least the basic concepts of who these people are, and in the modern sense, most don't. It's worth knowing. It's worth knowing, especially if this series has spurred an interest in history. One day, maybe down the road, we talked about this last night, that we'll get to Vietnam and kind of pivot into the modern era, and we go, where do we go next with heavy metal history? Maybe we go to Rome and spend 5 years doing that or whatever, but it's on my mind. I would love to go into Rome and have a conversation about Rome, because it's really, really interesting. But let's get back to France, yeah? Thanks for hanging out during the break and during my go learn about Rome speech. 5 years, not enough time. Bear in mind that I have 2.5-hour episodes, and I could cover the fall of the Roman Republic probably in 3 episodes, to be quite fair. But Gracchus Babeuf will return to the stage. But the increasingly conservative course of the revolution, now that it's under the Thermidorian Convention, was seen in the realm of the one issue which had been the most divisive over the entire course of the revolution. Any stabs from chat as to what you think that single issue which had been the most divisive was? Those of you that remember way back into the single digits of episodes? No? All right. It's religion. Remember that the decision to nationalize the church had been the big problem for a lot of common people, especially in the West. So the conservative Thermidorian Convention takes a look at religion and the way in which they handle the de-Christianization that's going on attests to how conservative they were.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
The Thermidorian leaders had no intention of returning France to an ancien regime style Catholic Church. They had neither the time nor the inclination or the resources, really, to do it. But they also wanted to reverse the turn against Christianity, which we have all seen over the course of all of these episodes, which had done so much to serve as a catalyst for domestic unrest all over France. Maximilien Robespierre may have mocked the whole cult of reason that was replacing Christianity in the de-Christianization section of the revolution more than anybody. But his answer to it was not to return the actual church to a position of prominence. It was to replace it with that megalomaniacal cult of the supreme being, which led to Jacques-Louis David creating a mountain effigy that Robespierre walked down from the top of like Moses. The Thermidorians wanted nothing to do with any of these things. So they hit on a brilliant idea, which was both utterly revolutionary and, in and of itself, let the French go back to being Catholics if they wanted to. On September 18, 1794, the convention officially suspended all payments earmarked for religious institutions. This meant they stopped funding the entire apparatus of the civic church. With a single line crossed out of the budget, the Thermidorian Convention cast aside the national church, which had been so polarizing since the very first civic oaths had been decreed way back in 1789 as a loyalty test of priests to be loyal to France over the Pope. But as they were zeroing out the religious budget, they also declared freedom of worship. This effectively meant that the French could now believe whatever they wanted, and the state was not going to pay for any of it anymore. You do whichever you want, be whatever religion you want. Don't expect the state to fund it. This is a de facto separation of church and state, and it was followed up on February 21st, 1795, with a decree to formally separate the church from the state. And something like that had really only ever been seen in the American Constitution, had never been really contemplated by anyone in France over the course of the Revolution before. What it really boils down to is religion was just not something the Thermidorian Convention wanted to argue with you about. Now, the Catholic Church was not allowed, as of yet, to just re-inhabit their old churches because those buildings were still technically public property by law. However, what you did in your own home was now your own business, and Mass was celebrated in Paris on March 8th, 1795, for the first time since October 1793. This is a city famous for the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it has a very rich Catholic history, but there had not been a Mass celebrated openly in Paris for a year and a half. Nowhere was the impact of the decrees on religious freedom felt more deeply than out in the Vendée. Remember, the Vendée uprising started for two basic reasons. What are you doing to the Catholic Church? Well, three. What are you doing to the Catholic Church? Don't you dare conscript us under the levy of 300,000, and we want the king back. Now, hard hit by the Reign of Terror and the Infernal Columns, the impact to the population of the terror had been staggering. Yep, stop going after my priests. Were they hiding them in barns? But much to the chagrin of the authorities in Paris, even in the spring of 1795, the guerrilla resistance forces still continued to plague the Republican effort to stamp out the last embers of hostility there. All of the major roads in the West were controlled by the state, by the Republicans. But loosely affiliated peasant guerrillas just refused to give up the fight. That's exactly what's going to happen in Russia, in Ukraine, by the way. Just saying, there's a parallel here. That you can try to roll in with force all you want, but there will be dedicated people that will never give it up if they feel that their cause is just. And these Vendée guerrillas refused to give it up. And as they were trying to figure out how to stamp out the last pieces of resistance, the convention was hit by some very disturbing news from up in Brittany, to the north of the Vendée on the west coast. Remember, the Brittany had been every bit as ticked off at Paris as the Vendée region had been. It's just that there had been a bigger troop presence there initially to keep them pacified. But Brittany had been further stirred up, remember, when the Catholic and Royal Army went across the Loire River north into Brittany to try to make their big play at Granville, because that's in Brittany. Pretty much right after that happened, and even though the Catholic and Royal Army as a force was destroyed, a popular uprising had gotten going in Brittany. And its members, to keep them separate from the Vendée rebels, were called the Chouannerie, named after the Chouan, Chouan. And the Chouan is a nickname, meaning the owl or the silent one. And the reason they were called the Chouannerie was because this Chouan nickname had been adopted by the two brothers who really were leading this new populist uprising in Brittany, the more famous of whom is known as Jean Cottereau, or more famously, Jean Chouan. I want to zoom in on Jean Chouan on the board here real quick. Look at the badge on his painting. That is the badge of the Catholic and Royal Army. Right there, sitting on Jean Chouan's vest. So in 1795, the concept isn't dead yet. Yep, you can see old board. There we go. Zoom in one more. All right. So out in the west, there's Jean Chouan, his brother, leading the Chouannerie in Brittany in an uprising still against Paris. And the Chouannerie were never as well armed or as well led as their neighbors to the south, but still something like 22,000 people had joined the Chouannerie movement after Granville. And by the summer of 1794, it had become, enough of a thing to make the Thermidorian Convention want to really change their entire approach out in the West. Obviously, vicious, bloody, heavy-handed tactics, drowning people in the river with barges that were designed to sink and, basically rolling through a General Sherman-like advance of the vernal columns and just mass murdering everyone wasn't leading to peace out there. So just as religious freedom, one of the three pillars of the entire revolt in the West, just as it was being cut out, just as religious freedom was being declared, in September 1794, General Lazare Hoche himself was dispatched personally to the Vendée to try to negotiate a way to a Republican victory, meaning, can you all just put it all down? We're different. And he went out there to do so with a carrot rather than a stick. Upon his arrival, Hoche set about granting amnesty to rebels and releasing prisoners, while indicating in his negotiations that the Thermidorian Convention was really ready to talk about this. And then on December 1st, 1794, the convention formally offered amnesty to all of the rebels who agreed to lay down their arms within a month, by January 1st, 1795. Now, naturally, the Vendée was pretty skeptical, right, about anything Paris might have to say because of what they've been through. But the decree of religious freedom was a huge signal that this might all be for real. Religion, again, had been like one of the three key issues, which had fired up the uprising in the first place, on top of the levy of 300,000 and the, what happened to the king. We want him back. The convention was now telling the Vendée and Brittany that we don't care who you worship with or how or whatever with respect to your worship. That's just not something we want to be involved in anymore. And then in late December 1794, the convention sent another clear signal that they were dead serious about putting the whole thing to rest, when Jean-Baptiste Carrier was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Remember, the tribunal executed less than 100 people from July to December 1794. And Carrier is one of them. There was an investigation into his conduct at Nantes, with the Republican baptisms, that had come back with the resounding result of, yeah, let's go ahead and put this guy on trial. And so at the end of November 1794, Carrier was put on trial. And at his trial, he was defiant. He said, I deny taking part in any of the, quote, contemptible deeds that he was being accused of. And then he said that he was only following orders, and that if he was guilty, the whole convention was guilty, quote, right down to the president's bell, end quote. And I don't really buy that. I mean, the convention didn't know what was going on in Nantes. The Committee of Public Safety did. So perhaps Carnot is a little liable here. But Carnot was not the political power player, and the Committee of Public Safety was Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon. And the whole defense of, only following orders maybe would have stuck. It wasn't really struck down as a indefensible defense until Nuremberg in the 1940s and 50s. But the tribunal did not agree with Mr. Carrier. They convicted him and sentenced him to death. And on December 16th, he became one of those last few victims of the guillotine. When word got back to the Vendée that the Butcher of Nantes had just lost his head, it turned a corner in their belief that the Thermidorian Convention was really serious about coming to terms. Now, Lazare Hoche's pitch turned out to be extremely generous and essentially conceded every point which the Vendée had gone to rebellion over. Freedom of worship was already confirmed. Hoche also offered exemption from the draft, which had been, the problem behind the levy of 300,000. Further, he offered compensation for property which had been destroyed or seized. The basic government of Paris position became, if the rebels laid down their arms, you can have everything you wanted. Except for that one demand they couldn't grant, which was, returning the king to the throne for obvious reasons. And this was very, very nearly the beginning of the end of the war in the Vendée. But unfortunately for everyone involved, we're not there just quite yet. Because as we will see next episode, the more intransient rebel leaders were delighted to be drawing out these negotiations with Paris because it lulled the Republicans into a false sense of security. And as the Republicans were so lulled, the rebel leaders negotiated with British contacts and French émigré leader backers based in London to land a new royalist force in the West to bring the region back into full revolt with the aim of getting that last unmeetable demand met, which was placing the young and still incarcerated Louis XVII onto a French throne. Now, next episode, we will see that these ambitions of landing this force will be dashed by the disastrous Quiberon Bay expedition in June of 1795. And Quiberon Bay is right here. But before we get...
Well, it's about tree fitting.
Before we get to the colossal comedy of errors that is the attempt to land in Quiberon, next episode we'll go back to Paris to follow the inevitable confrontation between the left and the right that's brewing again, which will turn into a decisive defeat for the left. But it will also convince the convention that if the political situation is ever going to stabilize, that France needed a new constitution. It won't be the Constitution of 1793, despite the demand of bread in the Constitution of 1793, but it will in fact become the French Directory. And that is episode 1.33. Hopefully you've all enjoyed it. Hopefully it was, for as wide-ranging topic-wise as it was, hopefully it was interesting, because I'm trying to pocket the Thermidorian Convention into a nice bucket so that we can pivot quickly to the Directory and really get rolling with Napoleon. Tonight is the first night of the Season 3 quiz. Gilly won Season 2. $20 will be donated on top of the monthly donation from Bits and Subs and Streamloots this month. On his behalf, he said no thank you to a piece of swag. Instead, he wants me to just take that money I would spend on a hat or something for him and throw it down in the donation pile. So that will happen likely in this week or next week. But the counters are reset. After the first question is announced, you'll see the leaderboard go back to zeros. Everybody's on even keel starting off, and this will be the quiz that takes us to the end of the French Revolution. I highly encourage you all to participate. Exclamation point answer, space, and your answer to answer the question. Everyone has an opportunity to participate. We do not compete against each other. We're just seeing if you got the right answer. Do not use the word fix with 2 X's. Master Poe.
Boy.
8-month tier 1. Thank you very much. Welcome in. Don't use the word boy. Don't use the word fix with 2 X's in your answer because it'll trigger different commands. And otherwise, do your best. Take a shot. There's no penalty for getting it wrong, except we'll clarify why it's wrong. But the whole idea of making an error or a mistake in the quiz is so that we can all learn, right? So participate. We really, 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 really want you to participate. So let's head over to the quiz. It probably still has a question up there from like a month ago, but we're going to get that off the board real quick here with the first question. Questions! The question timer, you have 1 minute to answer. The timer will begin as soon as I finish reading the question. Again, it's exclamation point answer, space, and your answer. I encourage you, take a stab. All those numbers are about to disappear. Gilly is Gilius won at 115 points at the end of last season. Here comes the first question of Season 3, and I need to change that to say Season 3. I didn't change it, and I forgot. So we'll get Season 3 up there for the French Revolution leaderboard after the show is over tonight. But here comes the first question of Season 3's quiz. Why were the British left to essentially defend the Netherlands by themselves in the fall of 1794 into the spring of 1795? Hey, the timer didn't come up. Well, there we go. That's broken. We'll have to figure that out. Thank you very much, everybody at OBS and Twitch, and I have to figure out why that's broken. So let's make 2 reminders. Reminder, fix the timer and fix the season number. Yep. Most of them seem to have worked themselves out. I don't know why this one didn't work. But we'll fix it. Time's up. We can still use the music, right? We'll still use the music because that's still a minute long and it works out. Maybe we don't even need the timer because the music's perfectly long. Let's see who answered the question and go from there. The Austrians had Russian invasion concerns in Poland to keep their attention. The Austrians and the Prussians, but yes, that's correct. There we go. Gilly scores a point to start the Season 3 board off. The next answer comes from Rocket. Prussia and Austria were distracted by the uprising in Poland, which they saw as a way for Russia to gain more control of Poland. Yep, they were also invading. But that is right. Poland is the answer. Anybody else to answer? As I go bring my bot back up so I can actually see what's going on there. Doc got in there because Prussia and Austria were about Poland uprising. Yes, Doc got it. And Rocket, Doc, that's it. So the next question. Why was the British defeat at Boxtel important? Season 3 underway. Gilly, Rocket, and Doc on the board. This is your chance to keep pace. In a couple weeks, the leaders will be way out in front. Why was the British defeat at Boxtel important? Rocket's in. Turry's in. Gilly's in. Timer's ticking. Why was the British defeat at Boxtel important? Doc is in. Arky's in. All right. Let's find out what everyone had to say. First up, I believe, is Rocket. Because they had retreated when they should have advanced. That's true. It wasn't the important part. It demoralized the army. Yes, the retreat demoralized the army. Really, really big time. The, quote, defeat at Boxtel really made the inevitability of a French victory fact for the British ground force on the continent. So that is correct, Rocket. Next answer. Turry, was a naval loss to cavalry. No, that was Dan Helder. Gilly, it further demoralized them and made them feel like a French victory against them was inevitable. Exactly the answer. Don't worry about it. We don't care about typos here, Doc. As long as I get the gist, we're good. Demoralizing the troops on a bad retreat call. Yep. Demoralized them. Big time was the context we're going for here. Arky. because their only objective was to maintain that area in Europe, and they lost it. Fair. I think the concept of what's going on there, you're talking about their single objective was to hold the Netherlands, and they were losing the Netherlands. We'll give you that, Archie. Get on the board. The next question. Half a point. Can't do half points. As long as you're in the realm of it and participating, I'm happy. The next question. General Jourdan's advance through Sprimont and Aldenhoven forced the Austrians to do something they had not done thus far in the war. What was it? General Jourdan's advance through Sprimont and Aldenhoven on his way to Cologne forced the Austrians to do something they had not done thus far in the war. What was it? Gilly and Rocket are in. Time is ticking. All right, time is up. If you get your answer in before we move on, we'll still take it. Rocket. Abandon the German principalities. Princeps, actually a term for Augustus Caesar. The German principalities and return to the east side of the Rhine. Rhine spelled R-H-I-N-E for future context. But yes, the Austrians' first impetus to get involved in a war with France was defense of these German principalities, these prince states, all over the east or the west side of the Rhine. And they abandoned all of it. And that is exactly the correct answer. Gilly's answer. They had committed to defending the emigres on the west bank of the Rhine, and they were forced to retreat from it. Retreating from the west bank of the Rhine. Yes, that's still correct. I don't think anybody else answered no. So we'll go to the next question. Copy this in. After her occupation of Poland, after the Second Partition, Catherine the Great took a move over the winter of 1793 to 1794 that forced Polish resistance into uprising again. What was it? Gilly is in. After her occupation of Poland following the Second Partition, Catherine the Great made a move over the winter of 1793-1794 that forced Polish resistance into uprising again. What was it? Rocket is in as the timer ticks on.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Dr. Death is in. One benefit of Doc's new schedule is I'm pretty sure he'll be here participating. And I know he's missed a ton of the French Revolution, but it's good to see you here. Terry's in. Alrighty, let's have a look at the answers. The first one is from Gilly. In order to reduce the standing Polish army from 50,000 to 15,000. That's exactly it. The underground was planning on using that army to usurp and throw out the Russians, and losing it was not good. She gave her grace to the Prussian and Austrian armies to come into Warsaw and fight. Nope, she only did that after the order to downsize the army happened. And the downsizing of the army order is what caused the Polish to stand up. So, yep, that's not correct. Doc, she gave the Austrians and Prussians permission. Same thing. True, she gave them independent permission to go to work in Poland, but the reason they had to was that order to reduce the force structure of the Polish army. She sharply lowered troop numbers in Poland. She ordered it. That's correct. hurry on the Season 3 board. And that was the last answer. We'll go to the next question. Again, 10 questions tonight. I think we're about halfway through here. Let me fix one misspelled word. What is the significance of the outcome of Kosciuszko's uprising for Poland in 1797 when the final treaty between Prussia, Austria, and Russia was signed? What is the significance of the outcome of Kosciuszko's uprising for Poland in 1797 when the final treaty between Prussia, Austria, and Russia was signed? Rocket is in. Pretty sure Rocket knows she also has the correct answer. Timer is ticking. What is the significance of the outcome of Kosciuszko's uprising for Poland in 1797 when the final treaty between Prussia, Austria, and Russia was signed? Doc is in. Gilly is in. Arky is in. So I will tell you what I was looking for here. Poland ceases to be a thing. That's the answer, right? Poland as a nation ceases to exist in all legitimate forms. Poland was gone for 123 years. Yep. Until the Treaty of Versailles. Doc, Poland was divided between them and was no longer independent, i.e. no longer even named Poland. Yep, no Poland. Gilly, it eliminated Poland from the map and killed more people than the Great Terror. The second part, yes, that happened before 1797, but it eliminates Poland from the map. That is correct. It returned Poland to become part of Russia. That's not accurate enough. It actually took Poland and said, and cut pieces and handed it to the Prussians, to the Austrians, to the Russians, and there was no Poland left. So it didn't return Poland to Russia because it sent pieces of it to other places as well. This one everyone should be able to get, hopefully, very easily. Why did the French campaign of 1794 not end? Why did General Pichegru continue marching north? I spelled Pichegru wrong. G-R-U, not G-E-U. Pichegru. Why did the campaign of 1794 not end for both General Pichegru and General Jourdan, basically? Timer is ticking. Gilly's in. Rocket's in. Timer is almost up. There we go. Our answers are... He heard there were 14 Dutch ships stuck in a harbor and wanted to see it. Nope. Rivers were frozen. This is the Boxtel crossing the Wall River decision. Why did Pichegru not stop? Because he could cross the rivers because they were frozen. Gilly. They knew they could march across the rivers during harsh winter that had frozen them over, so they didn't have to fight over bridgeheads and could keep pushing. That is the correct answer. The strategy, it's okay, Doc. I like the fact that people are participating because the whole point of the quiz is to clarify points that maybe we went through too fast. So thank you for answering regardless. Gilly gets it. We'll take the next answer, I think. Yep, I think Doc got in after that, but we'll see what it is. He heard that the Dutch ships were frozen in the bay. That happened after he got to Amsterdam, right? So we clarify this point. The rivers froze, which enabled him to cross the Wall River and other rivers. Amsterdam is to the north of the Wall River. So the frozen rivers allowed him to proceed north. Once he got to Amsterdam, then he heard, hey, there's 14 ships frozen in the harbor at Den Helder. Let's go lead a cavalry charge against that, which is insane. And if I ever find a painting of it, I want it on my wall. All right, the next question. Pichegru's advance through Amsterdam and even further north signified a shift in British strategy in the war. What was it? I see, you know what? Let's have a look. Such an image exists. I'm going to put it on the board so you guys can see it when we come back from the quiz. Gilly and Arky are in. Time is almost up. Doc is in. Pichegru's advance through Amsterdam and even further north signified a shift in British strategy in the war. What was it? Prompted was probably a better term. They abandoned their land war in the continental Europe and instead decided to use their powerful navy to focus on sea engagement and containment. That is correct. Next answer. Shifted primarily naval military. Correct. Doc, they shifted to a naval focus, yes. The big thing is they withdrew their entire land force from the continent. Made it just a naval fight for them. And the big reason is because they weren't getting any support from their allies. Doc gets it. I don't think we got anybody else in there, but we'll double check. Nope, that's it. Next question. As we roll into the final three, I believe. What were the reasons the assignat value had plunged over the course of 1793 into 1794? Yeah, he does take very complex, very detailed notes. At some point, I'm just going to hand Gilly my outlines. So here, you want it? There you go. And then say, find me a publisher. What were the reasons? Even getting one reason here is good enough. What were the reasons the assignat value had plunged over the course of 1793, 1794? Doc. Yep. That one will do. Rocket. That one is the same one, and that will do. Gilly. Same answer again, and that'll do. Apparently everyone got that point. All right, all three of you got it. You all said the same thing, overprinting of paper money, which led to inflation because it wasn't really being backed by anything. And that is one reason. I'm going to tell you the other reasons again. I can see the answers in the bot. Yep. The convention had been reduced inflation by just printing assignat as needed without backing it for anything. Yeah, that's the big reason. The maximum, not having a stick in the terror anymore, led to decreased value, right? Because it just spawned a complete replacement secondary market. The winter. The winter, as we rolled out of 1794, also crushed the value of the assignat because we returned to the free market just in time to have the weather destroy that attempt. Those are the reasons. 2 questions left to go. This one I went into some depth on. Why is Francois Noel Gracchus Babus' use of the term Tribune of the People for his newspaper especially significant? Again, Poe, thank you for the resub. Gilly, Dustin, thank you for the resubs. Rocket and Gilly, thanks for the host early on. I appreciate him as well. Thanks for hanging out in general tonight, guys. Got one more question left after this one, and then probably heading over to Fabled as they're running D&D tonight. I think Rich is about to be done. Why is Francois Noel Gracchus Babus' use of the term Tribune of the People for his newspaper especially significant? Gilly is in, Rocket's in, Dr. Death is in. Gilly, the Tribune was a body of the people that could veto legislation from the Roman Senate. It was actually an office. It was a single office. But yes, I'm not going to be that picky. The Tribune of the People was an elected office, just like Consul was an elected office, and Censor was an elected office. It was just one that patricians couldn't enter into. It was only plebeians. It was designed to give them an enhanced voice after centuries of demand for more political authority from them, but it is close enough. The Tribune of the People in Roman Republican times could propose and veto legislation, and there was one representing effectively every district of Rome, so they could actually veto each other too. But it was an office, not a body. Not a problem. That's why we do this, right? Rocket. It referred back to Roman times and represented the sect of leaders for the plebeians that could veto laws passed by the Senate. Sect is a bad word, but yeah, sect connotates like cult. It was an elected office again, but yes, that's good enough. Doc. Because it ties back to what the Romans defined tribune as, which is a civilian rep that has power to veto Senate. Yes, you can tell Doc has gone through the Dan Carlin. All right, one more question to go. My answer that I wrote down for this one in my notes, by the way, and I have question and answer just so I have something to reference to, is duh. Because I know the answer to this one like the back of my hand. Last question of the night. Again, thanks all for hanging out tonight. What is the single biggest impact of the turn to religious freedom in France in 1794, 1795? $1795. Not too far away from when Napoleon's fully in charge. There's going to be an interesting couple of years, which will take us to Egypt. One more time, Turi. It's okay. Got scrolled past really quickly. Wow. Well, I don't type anything. The answer. It removed one of the three major wedge issues in the Vendée. It allowed there to be legitimate negotiations for peace. It introduced an official separation of church and state and French government. That's not the biggest impact. That didn't mean that much to the everyday goings on at the time. The big impact was the Vendée and the West looking back to Paris going, Are they serious? Can we trust them? Return to the Catholic Church. Nope. Churches stopped being funded by the French government. Nope. Anyone could worship whatever they wanted, and there was finally a mass held in Paris after a year and a half. Those are both facts, but they're not the most important impact. That is the end of valid answers. Think Doc came in after the buzzer. Allowed the people to believe what they wanted and caused separation of church and state. So we all hold the separation of church and state dear because of, in the U.S. Constitution. But the immediate major thing was that one of the three major reasons that the Vendée had gone into a fireball was, what are you doing to my church? Don't draft me into your war. I want the king back. So when the government said, hey, have your church back, this nasty fight that had turned into a guerrilla war had a foothold for peace. That was the biggest one. So, I'll show you that painting. So this is really cool. I'm going to zoom in on a little bit. I love this. Look at this. Just the tall Dutch ships. You have the actual advancing units going across the ice. I want this painting. It's really awesome. Really, really cool painting. All right. So we'll be back next week, hopefully. I have a very different week coming up work-wise. I have to be in the office for at least 3 days, as I have a new staff member starting that I have to do orientation for. They're an outside hire, which makes it a little more complicated. I am actually going to start writing an hour a day starting Monday instead of Wednesday, like I usually do, and try to make up for that in the hopes that I will be done by sometime Thursday instead of Friday. I still anticipate I'll be able to get the episode done, barring that, something other ridiculousness doesn't happen. No worries, Gilly. Thanks for hanging out tonight. But, yeah, we're going to get into Bread and the Constitution of 1793 and the failed Quiberon Bay invasion and start really getting ready for Napoleon, because we will, in the following episode, be talking about the famous whiff of grape shot that Napoleon really got his full public career going under. Yeah, good to see you too, Doc. So we're going to do our normal outro stuff. I have no clue if the freaking thing is actually going to work, because why would it? It's, overlays have been stupid lately. Thank you, OBS. We'll take the next update when it comes. Some of the things are now working again. But here we go. We're also going to raid Fable 42. They're playing D&D. There's Dustin, Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I know he has Forbidden West and Elden Ring on the schedule for the week. Then hang out with my good friend Permanoob, playing Farming Simulator still after Dustin is over, starting at 10 a.m., going to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And then there's my good friend Gilius, who was here and streams on Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday night from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I think he's getting ready to go to Forbidden West. There is Rocket. She was playing Forbidden West this morning and getting frustrated by a couple of enemies. Sometimes during the day on weekdays, but Saturday mornings for sure. Hang out with her as well. Then make sure you stop by CF Live. He has done the music for our show. He's a good guy, a good friend of mine, and yeah, just generally a good person. Take your requests on Friday, plays music on Monday, Wednesdays as well. Now there's Mr. Diggity, streaming video games Sundays, Thursday nights for sure. Also plays some music. We'll play with you. Have a great night. I'm out of here. We're going to see Fable. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Be excellent to each other.